Picture two rooms on the same night, thousands of miles apart, both deciding the same question without ever speaking to each other. In one, officers in Tehran are studying a map of the western border, marking positions along a mountain range they have never fully controlled. In the other, a handful of Kurdish commanders sit around a radio, waiting to see if a promise made in Washington will turn into anything real. Neither room has the full picture. That gap between what gets decided at a table and what actually happens on a ridgeline is where this entire story lives, and almost nobody outside the region ever sees it. Most coverage of the war inside Iran fixated on missiles and airstrikes, the kind of footage that fills a newsfeed for a night and then disappears. Quieter and far more consequential, something else was happening the whole time along Iran's western mountains, and it barely made a ripple in the wider conversation. Before getting into what actually happened there, it helps to understand who was involved, because most people were never really told. The Kurds make up somewhere between 10 and 12% of Iran's population. That sounds like a modest slice of a country until you convert it into real numbers, which puts it in the millions, concentrated mostly along the western border in a region they call Iranian Kurdistan. They have their own language, their own culture, an identity that has survived for generations under a government that has spent decades trying to grind it down. And here is the detail that reframes everything that follows. None of this started with the current war. Kurds have been fighting for basic autonomy inside Iran for nearly half a century, long before any missile fell in this conflict, and long before most people watching the news tonight were even born. Rewind to 1979. The Iranian Revolution had just toppled the Shah, and for one brief, hopeful stretch, Kurdish leaders believed their moment had finally arrived. Fighters known as the Peshmerga, organized under leaders like Abdul Rahman Ghassemlu, moved fast and took control of large stretches of Iranian Kurdistan. For a short window, decades of waiting looked like they might finally pay off. Then Ayatollah Khomeini's new Islamic Republic refused to even discuss autonomy, and instead declared what it called a holy war against the Kurdish movement that same year. What followed was brutal. Roughly 10,000 people were killed. 1,200 Kurdish political prisoners were executed. That single chapter became the wound that never closed, the soil everything afterward grew out of. The decades that followed saw the conflict rise and fall in waves, never fully disappearing, only ever going quiet before flaring again. In the mid-2000s, a new insurgent campaign launched from the mountains along the Iraqi border. Around 2011, Iran ran a major offensive specifically targeting Kurdish forces. And in 2018, in one of the coldest moments in this whole history, Iran fired a barrage of ballistic missiles directly at a Kurdish political party's headquarters inside Iraq, killing at least 18 people during a leadership meeting. Sit with that for a second. Ballistic missiles launched across an international border at a political meeting, not a military base, not a training camp. That is the level of force Iran had already shown itself willing to use against Kurdish opposition long before the current war ever started. And it tells you exactly what kind of response Kurdish resistance has always faced. So when the current war broke out in the closing days of winter, Kurdish opposition groups were not starting from zero. They were stepping into a role they had quietly been preparing for, built on decades of survival, loss, and hard experience most outside observers never fully grasped. In the months of instability leading into the war, major Kurdish parties had already called for general strikes, and those strikes were widely observed across Kurdish regions, shopkeepers, workers, students closing their doors in coordinated defiance. Small insurgent operations had already been quietly underway, and crucially, separate Kurdish factions had formally united under a single new coalition, giving them, for the first time in years, one coordinated political and military voice instead of scattered, fragmented resistance. On the very first day of the war, that coalition put out a public statement. Their forces, they said, were already positioned deep inside Iranian territory and along the Iran-Iraq border, ready to respond as things developed. Within hours of the opening strikes of this war, Kurdish forces were already mobilized and in position. That is not coincidence. That is years of preparation, waiting for exactly this moment. Iran's response came fast and hard. Within days, Iran struck Kurdish opposition bases inside Iraq directly, killing at least one fighter almost immediately. Within a week, Iran issued a direct warning that it would hit facilities across the entire Kurdistan region of Iraq if Kurdish militants were allowed to use that territory to strike into Iran. The Kurdistan regional government found itself boxed in, Iranian threats on one side, armed Kurdish factions operating from within its own borders on the other, unable to fully satisfy either without risking real consequences. Then something happened that shifted the whole tone of the story. Word emerged that Washington was actively weighing support for armed opposition groups inside Iran, including Kurdish militias. When President Trump was asked point-blank whether he would back a Kurdish offensive, his answer left no room for doubt. He said plainly that he would be all for it. 4 words spoken almost casually, carrying the weight of a potential turning point in the entire war. According to further reporting, the offer went beyond words. The United States reportedly floated serious air cover and additional backing for anti-regime Kurdish groups, specifically aimed at helping them seize territory across western Iran. In private conversations, Kurdish leaders were reportedly told they needed to pick a side, stand with Washington and Israel, or stay aligned with Tehran. No middle ground left standing. Then the story shifted rooms again, this time to Washington. Reports surfaced that the United States was actively weighing support for armed opposition groups inside Iran, Kurdish militias among them. When President Trump was asked point-blank whether he would back a Kurdish offensive, he did not hedge. He said he would be all for it. 4 words, spoken almost casually, carrying the weight of a possible turning point in the entire war. Later reporting suggested the offer went further than words. The United States reportedly floated serious air cover and additional backing for anti-regime Kurdish groups, aimed specifically at helping them seize territory across western Iran. In private conversations, Kurdish leaders were reportedly told they needed to pick a side, stand with America and Israel, or stay aligned with the Iranian government. No middle ground left standing. Try putting yourself in that position for a moment, being handed a choice like that after generations of watching outside powers promise support and then disappear the instant things got difficult. That history alone explains why Kurdish leadership did not rush in. However tempting American backing looked on paper, they had heard versions of this offer before, from different governments in different decades, and they remembered how those stories usually ended. One Kurdish spokesperson laid out where things actually stood with unusual honesty. Kurdish forces, he said, were watching everything closely, but had no immediate plans for a full-scale ground offensive. He also confirmed something extraordinary, that President Trump had reportedly spoken directly, one-on-one, with senior Kurdish leadership about possible involvement in the war. A direct line between the White House and Kurdish command that would have been almost unthinkable in earlier decades of this conflict. This particular spokesperson carried his own scars into that conversation. He had been present and personally injured during the 2018 missile strike on Kurdish headquarters, the one that killed 18 people in a leadership meeting. He had survived an attack meant to silence him for good. And even after surviving that, he pushed back gently, arguing that Kurdish resistance remained strong while urging Western governments to help Iranian opposition groups coordinate more effectively, rather than offering scattered support that shows up, makes headlines, and then vanishes without leaving any lasting structure behind. Analysts tracking the region kept coming back to one point most casual observers missed entirely. Kurdish military leaders wanted real, guaranteed commitments before committing to anything as serious as a full offensive. One opposition figure summed up the entire dilemma in a single line. "We cannot move," he said, "if the air above us is not cleared." That sentence carries an entire history inside it. Kurdish forces had watched, more than once, what happens when they rise up without real air cover against a government willing to fire ballistic missiles outside its own borders. This was not fear, it was caution paid for in advance, in names they still remember and graves they still visit. It is worth sitting with that for a second, because it is easy to judge decisions like these from a distance and assume they were simple. They never are. Every choice those leaders made was shaped by scars most of the world never learned about, and it raises a fair question for anyone watching from the outside. How many chances would you give a partner who kept walking away right when things got hard? Despite the early momentum and clear American interest, the window for a large, coordinated Kurdish offensive quietly closed without the kind of decisive action many had expected once Trump spoke so openly about backing it. Kurdish groups stayed cautious through the spring, and for good reason. There was no real confidence that the United States would follow through on a long-term commitment. Kurdish leadership worried, not without cause, that America might support an opening push and then step back partway through, repeating a pattern of abandonment Kurdish movements had lived through many times before. That was not paranoia, it was pattern recognition, earned across generations of broken promises that predate everyone currently fighting this war. On top of that hesitation came leaked details of offensive planning and mounting pressure from a different direction entirely: Turkey. Turkey carries its own long-standing anxiety about any strengthened, independent Kurdish military capability appearing anywhere nearby. A worry rooted in its own decades-long conflict with Kurdish separatist movements inside its own borders. A stronger, better coordinated Kurdish force just across the frontier was never going to sit well in Ankara, regardless of who that force happened to be fighting. Between American uncertainty, Turkish pressure, and a memory that refused to let its guard down, the window that had briefly looked wide open quietly shut again. An opportunity that could have reshaped an entire region simply faded, not for lack of courage among Kurdish fighters, but because trust, the most fragile resource in any conflict, was never fully built. Tehran, meanwhile, was not sitting still either. It reinforced its border regions along Iraqi Kurdistan, pressured the Iraqi government to expel Kurdish opposition groups from its territory outright, and reactivated a pro-Iranian Kurdish militia, a force built specifically to counter the independent anti-regime Kurdish groups operating in the same terrain. This was not simple defense. It was a coordinated effort to weaken Kurdish resistance from several directions at once, mixing diplomacy, military reinforcement, and rival Kurdish forces in the same campaign. Out along the border, the strikes against Kurdish opposition camps inside Iraq kept coming at a brutal, steady pace. In one attack in March, an Iranian ballistic missile barrage killed 6 Kurdish fighters and wounded roughly 30 others, hitting a divisional headquarters directly. Local officials overseeing Kurdish military affairs called it a hostile and treacherous act, a violation of even the most basic principles of neighborly relations. Unusually blunt language from officials who typically chose their words carefully. By mid-April, reports confirmed that Iraqi Kurdistan had already been struck 16 separate times, even after a formal ceasefire had supposedly taken effect. 16 times after a ceasefire. That number alone tells you how little the broader truce actually meant for Kurdish opposition areas specifically. To most of the world, the fighting looked paused. Along that border, it never actually stopped. It just stopped making headlines. From here, the story hardens into something more serious. Beginning in early June, sustained clashes erupted between Kurdish opposition fighters and Iranian security forces in the highlands of western Iran. What started as scattered skirmishes gained real structure through late June and into July. The fighting spread across the Iran-Iraq border region into multiple towns and cities, pulling in Kurdish factions that had previously stayed on the sidelines, watching and waiting. This became the most significant sustained ground confrontation between Kurdish opposition and the Iranian state in years. Organizations monitoring security inside Iranian Kurdistan reported clashes breaking out across several cities at once, a level of coordinated resistance not seen in a long time. This was no longer a handful of isolated incidents on a map. It was starting to look like a genuine connected front. And in the middle of that escalation, something new appeared. A previously unknown militant group calling itself Sons of Hope surfaced and attacked local pro-government militia members in a Kurdish town, killing 2 and injuring 2 more. Days later, the group formally announced its own existence, stating its goals were to raise political awareness, strengthen Kurdish national identity, and directly confront the policies of the Islamic Republic. a name, a mission, and an act of violence, all within days of each other, as though this group had been waiting for precisely the right moment to step into the open. This was not one of the older, established Kurdish factions carrying decades of history. It was a brand new organization, born directly out of this war, a sign that the wider mobilization across Kurdish regions was generating entirely new resistance capacity that had not existed before the conflict began. New fighters, new names, a new generation stepping in to finish what their parents and grandparents started. The fighting kept climbing through July. In one particularly heavy clash, Kurdish forces reported 6 of their own fighters killed in an ambush by Iranian forces, while Iranian sources gave a different casualty count for the same engagement. The numbers never quite matching, the way they rarely do in conflicts where every side has a reason to shape the story in its favor. What stood out most, though, was not the disputed math. It was that Kurdish forces publicly named every fighter who died. Not statistics, not a vague tally, but actual names, spoken aloud and honored publicly. A human detail most coverage erased entirely. Somewhere, families heard those names read and understood exactly what they meant. And it is worth asking yourself what it would take for a name in your own family to be spoken that way, in public, as proof that a life mattered. One expert closely watching the conflict offered a careful, measured read on what the escalation actually represented. "This is not business as usual," he said, "not simply the periodic border clashes seen for years. Something had genuinely shifted. It was a warning wrapped inside a plain sentence, the kind experts use when they want you to understand that the ground under a story has actually moved. It captures the turning point precisely. More serious than the sporadic skirmishes of previous decades, but not yet the full-scale, decisive uprising that had briefly seemed possible when American air cover was being openly discussed back in the spring. Somewhere between quiet resistance and complete uprising, something new and dangerous had taken shape, in a space history had not fully prepared anyone to predict. It is fair to wonder why this escalation landed specifically in June and July, rather than during the chaotic opening weeks of the war, when American support seemed most directly on the table. The timing makes sense once you stop assuming wars only escalate when outside powers are cheering from the sidelines. A formal memorandum in mid-June paused the main fighting between the United States, Israel, and Iran. That pause, though, never extended to how Iran treated Kurdish opposition groups. Strikes on Kurdish positions inside Iraq continued straight through that supposed ceasefire, even as the rest of the world's attention drifted elsewhere, assuming the conflict had cooled. For most of the planet, the war looked like it was winding down. For Kurdish communities along that border, nothing had actually changed. With Iran clearly continuing to treat Kurdish resistance as a serious ongoing threat, regardless of any formal truce, it becomes easier to understand why Kurdish groups may have calculated that this particular stretch, when Iran's broader military focus was theoretically less consumed by the main conflict, offered a more realistic opening to escalate, even without the dramatic large-scale American air cover that had briefly been floated months earlier. Sometimes the best moment to move is not when the world is watching, but exactly when it has looked away. Step back from the individual clashes for a moment and look at what all of this actually costs Iran beyond the visible battlefield reports. Every soldier kept stationed along the western border, watching for Kurdish movement, is a soldier unavailable anywhere else. Every missile fired at a Kurdish position inside Iraq is a missile no longer available for any other front. Every hour spent negotiating with the Iraqi government about expelling Kurdish opposition groups is an hour of diplomatic energy spent on an internal problem, instead of the larger war dominating international headlines. That is what fighting on multiple fronts actually means in practice. It is not a clean division of forces. It is the grinding, exhausting reality of constantly choosing where limited attention goes next. And Iran's own actions show exactly how it has made that choice. You do not fire ballistic missiles at a political meeting unless you view the people inside that room as a lasting threat. You do not strike the same region 16 times during a supposed ceasefire unless stopping would cost you more than continuing. Every action Iran took against Kurdish opposition throughout this war tells you how seriously Tehran views this threat, whatever its official statements might claim in public. There is something symbolic tangled up in all of this too. Iran has spent decades presenting itself to its own citizens and to the wider world as a unified nation standing firm against outside enemies. A sustained internal insurgency rooted in a population that has never fully accepted the legitimacy of the government ruling over it tells a very different story. One of a nation that has never actually achieved the internal unity its leadership likes to claim. In the middle of an already difficult war, that kind of internal fracture becomes far more dangerous and far more expensive than it would be in peacetime. So where does that leave things? And what does it actually mean to say Kurdish fighters accomplished something significant against Iran during this war? The honest answer is this. Kurdish opposition groups sustained and genuinely escalated a real ongoing insurgency across western Iran throughout the conflict. They moved from a cautious, watchful posture in the earliest weeks to sustained ground clashes by June and July, spreading across multiple cities and even producing an entirely new organized resistance group, Sons of Hope, that did not exist before this war began. That is not a small outcome for a population that has spent nearly 50 years fighting for basic recognition. This was not the dramatic, decisive territorial offensive President Trump had floated supporting back in the spring, when he spoke about full American air cover and outright seizure of western Iranian territory. That scale of offensive never materialized, but it was also far more than routine, sporadic border friction that could be waved off as background noise. It sits in a category history has not fully written a label for yet. Real fighters died on both sides. Multiple cities experienced sustained, serious clashes, and Iran treated this Kurdish resistance as significant enough to justify continued missile strikes, heavy border reinforcement, and the deliberate reactivation of loyalist militia forces built specifically to counter it. Governments do not commit that level of military resource against something they consider minor. They reveal what actually worries them, not through statements, but through where they choose to spend their limited time, money, and firepower. That is the clearest way to understand what Kurdish fighters actually accomplished throughout this war. They did not topple the regime, they did not seize decisive new territory, the way the most optimistic early talk once suggested might happen. But they sustained something arguably just as consequential, a genuine, costly, ongoing internal security crisis that forced Iran to continuously divert real military and political resources toward managing it, even during stretches when the wider international conflict was supposedly on pause. Think about what that actually means for a government already stretched thin. Iran was not fighting one war against one enemy. It was fighting a war on its southern waters, a war in the diplomatic arena, and quietly, consistently, a war inside its own western mountains against its own citizens. People who have been asking for basic recognition and autonomy for nearly 50 years. 3 fronts, 3 sets of pressure, all draining the same limited pool of resources at once. There is a lesson tucked inside all of this that reaches well beyond Iran, well beyond the Kurds, well beyond this one war. Whenever a government spends decades refusing to address a population's basic demands, that tension does not simply vanish. It waits. It survives underground, sometimes for generations, carried quietly through families, through memory, through grief that never fully fades. When a larger crisis eventually arrives and the government's attention is pulled elsewhere, that old, unresolved tension tends to resurface, sometimes stronger than anyone expected, because it was never actually resolved. It was only ever postponed. That is exactly what happened here. This was never simply a wartime insurgency that appeared out of nowhere the moment missiles started falling. It is the latest chapter in a story that began in 1979, ran through assassinations in Vienna and Berlin, through missile strikes on political meetings, through decades of strikes, offensives, and quiet resistance that never fully disappeared even when the headlines moved elsewhere. This war simply gave that old story a new, more visible stage. And maybe that is the part worth carrying away from all of it. Wars are rarely fought on just one battlefield. While the world's attention stayed fixed on missiles, warships, and international headlines, an entirely separate conflict, rooted in decades of unresolved history, was quietly reshaping how much strength Iran actually had left to fight everyone else. Every front feeds into every other front, whether the world notices or not. The Kurdish story inside this war is not a footnote. It is proof that some of the most important battles never make the front page, and some of the most consequential fighters never appear in a single major headline, even while shaping the outcome of an entire war from mountains that history pushed them into decades before any of this began. Whether that history finally gets resolved or simply waits underground for the next crisis to expose it all over again is a question nobody watching this war from the outside has an easy answer to.